You're embarrassing yourself. Leave. Now. The sentence didn't echo. It sliced, sharp and deliberate, through the polished stillness of the Grand Meridian hotel lobby, where crystal chandeliers hung like frozen constellations, and every step usually whispered wealth instead of conflict. But not today, not in this moment. Not with all eyes slowly turning toward the man standing alone at the center of it all. Malcolm Hayes didn't move, didn't react the way they expected, didn't shrink under the weight of the manager's voice that had just publicly reduced him to something less than welcome, less than worthy, less than seen. He simply stood there, hands resting calmly in the pockets of a charcoal jacket that carried no visible brand, no flashing label, nothing to signal what he was worth to anyone trained to judge by surface alone. And that was exactly the problem, because in a place like this, appearance wasn't just style, it was currency, and Malcolm, to them, looked underfunded. The manager, Daniel Whitmore, a tall white man, in his early 50s with a silver tie clip and a posture sharpened by years of unchecked authority, took a step closer, lowering his voice just enough to sound controlled, but not enough to hide the edge in it. Sir, I'm asking you politely. This lobby is for registered guests only. The words sounded procedural, almost rehearsed, but the tone carried something heavier, something older, something Malcolm had heard before. Not in this building, not yet, but in others just like it, years ago. Decades ago, back when he didn't have the leverage to let silence speak for him. But that version of him wasn't here anymore. What stood in that lobby now was something else entirely, something refined by time, sharpened by memory, and anchored by control. Malcolm's eyes moved slowly across the room, taking in the subtle reactions unfolding around him. A couple seated near the marble fireplace paused mid-conversation, their curiosity outweighing their comfort. A concierge behind the desk hesitated, fingers hovering over a keyboard as if unsure whether to intervene or disappear, and near the far column, a young woman in a navy blazer, and in turn by the look of her badge, watched more closely than the others, her brows slightly drawn, her instincts already questioning the narrative forming too quickly in front of her. Malcolm finally spoke, his voice low, even, not defensive, not aggressive, just present. Check the reservation again, he said, and for a moment, just a fraction of a second, the room held its breath, because there was something in the way he said it, something that didn't match the role he'd been assigned. Daniel exhaled through his nose, clearly unimpressed, and glanced back toward the front desk where another staff member, Lauren, a woman in her 30s with a tight smile and sharper eyes, tapped at the system with exaggerated patience. There's nothing under that name, she said without looking up, her tone flat but final, as if the system itself had spoken and no further discussion was required. Malcolm didn't move, didn't reach for his phone, didn't raise his voice. He simply nodded once, almost to himself, as if confirming something far more important than a missing reservation. The intern shifted her weight slightly, her gaze flicking between Malcolm and the screen. She had seen the name earlier. She was almost certain of it, but uncertainty in a hierarchy like this was dangerous, and speaking up carried a cost she wasn't sure she could afford. Daniel stepped closer again, now clearly irritated by the lack of compliance. Sir, I'm not going to repeat myself, he said, louder this time, making sure the room heard him. If you're not a guest, you need to leave. And there it was, the escalation, not just a request, but a declaration, a line drawn not on policy, but perception. Malcolm tilted his head slightly, studying Daniel's face with a calm that felt almost out of place in the rising tension. And if I am a guest, he asked, not as a challenge, but as a question that carried weight. Daniel didn't hesitate, didn't reconsider, didn't even blink. Then you'd be able to prove it, he replied, and the words landed with a quiet arrogance that assumed the outcome before the process. Malcolm let the silence stretch just long enough for the discomfort to settle into the room, just long enough for the observers to feel the imbalance forming. Then he reached slowly into his pocket, not for a wallet, not for a card, but for his phone. The movement subtle, deliberate, controlled, the kind of movement that didn't ask for attention but commanded it anyway. The intern leaned forward slightly, her instincts sharpening. Daniel's eyes narrowed, watching closely, as if expecting resistance, expecting escalation, expecting something he could justify responding to. But Malcolm didn't give him that. He simply unlocked the screen and held it for a moment, his reflection faintly visible against the glass. And in that reflection, for just a split second, the past flickered, a younger version of himself standing in a different lobby, years ago, wearing a suit he couldn't quite afford yet, being told politely, quietly, that there were no rooms available, even though he had a confirmation in hand, even though he had done everything right, even though he had believed that would be enough. It hadn't been then, and for a long time, it wasn't. But that memory didn't sting anymore. It steadied him, anchored him, reminded him that moments like this weren't new. They were patterns, and patterns, once understood, could be broken. Malcolm's thumb hovered over the screen, then pressed once, decisive, intentional. And somewhere beyond the walls of the Grand Meridian, something shifted, unseen, unheard, but very real. Daniel crossed his arms, impatience now fully visible. "If you're calling someone, I suggest you make it quick," he said, attempting to reclaim control of a situation that had already begun to slip. Malcolm didn't look at him, didn't acknowledge the remark. He simply spoke into the phone, his voice steady, precise. "Activate executive access." And the words didn't sound like a plea, didn't sound like a workaround. They sounded like a command, and for the first time, the room didn't just feel tense, it felt uncertain. Lauren's fingers paused over the keyboard. The intern's eyes widened slightly. Daniel's posture shifted, just enough to betray a flicker of doubt, not in what he had said, but in what he might have missed. Malcolm lowered the phone, slipped it back into his pocket, and returned to stillness, the kind of stillness that wasn't passive, but deliberate, as if he had just set something in motion that no one else could yet see. The chandeliers above continued to glow. The marble floors still reflected the room's elegance, but the atmosphere had changed, subtly, undeniably, like the air before a storm that hadn't yet announced itself. And Malcolm Hayes, standing exactly where he had been told he didn't belong, looked completely, unshakably at home. The silence did not break right away. It stretched, thin and fragile, like glass about to crack, but not yet willing to shatter. And in that space between certainty and doubt, something subtle began to shift across the Grand Meridian lobby. Not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable. Lauren's screen flickered once, just a blink, the kind most people would miss. But she did not. Her fingers froze mid-keystroke, eyes narrowing as the system refreshed on its own without her command. A small delay, less than a second, but enough to disrupt her confidence. Daniel noticed it too, not because of the screen, but because of her hesitation, and hesitation did not belong in a place built on precision. "What is it?" he asked, low, controlled, but edged with impatience. Lauren swallowed lightly, eyes still fixed on the monitor. "The system is updating," she said, and even as she spoke, the words sounded wrong, because systems in this building did not update without notice, not during peak hours, not in the middle of an interaction like this. The intern took a step closer to the desk, just enough to see over Lauren's shoulder, her pulse quickening as lines of data reorganized themselves, categories shifting, access levels recalibrating, and then she saw it. The name, clear, undeniable, Malcolm Hayes, not under standard reservations, not under VIP, but under a classification she had only seen once before during training, executive owner access. Her breath caught, not because of what it meant, but because of what had just happened in front of everyone. Daniel leaned slightly, trying to read Lauren's expression before the screen. "Well?" he pressed. Lauren's lips parted, but no words came out at first. The certainty she had relied on just seconds ago, dissolving into something far more dangerous. Doubt. Malcolm remained still, watching none of this directly, yet aware of every shift, every glance, every crack forming in the narrative that had been so confidently built against him. He did not rush it, did not interrupt it, because truth, when it surfaces on its own, carries more weight than anything spoken in defense. The intern finally spoke, her voice quieter than she intended, but clear enough to reach the space between them. "Sir, his name is in the system." Daniel turned sharply, eyes narrowing. "Under what category?" he asked, the question sharp, immediate. The intern hesitated, not because she did not know, but because saying it out loud would change everything. Lauren closed her eyes briefly, as if hoping the screen would correct itself. But when she opened them again, The classification remained bold, unambiguous. She turned slowly toward Daniel, her composure slipping just enough to be noticed. "Executive level," she said, and the words did not land softly. They dropped, heavy, reshaping the air around them. Daniel's jaw tightened, the first real fracture in his authority visible in the tension along his face. "That is not possible," he replied quickly. Too quickly, as if speed could override reality. He stepped forward, placing himself between the desk and Malcolm, reclaiming space that no longer felt entirely his. "Systems glitch," he added, louder now, addressing not just Lauren, but the room, the observers, the uncertainty that had begun to spread. Malcolm tilted his head slightly, his expression unchanged, but his presence now carried something else, not just calm, but gravity, the kind that pulls attention without effort. The couple by the fireplace leaned in closer, no longer pretending to ignore what was unfolding. The concierge stopped typing altogether, and the intern stood frozen, caught between hierarchy and truth. Malcolm spoke again, his voice steady, measured. "You should check the ownership records," he said, not as a challenge, but as a suggestion that carried quiet inevitability. Daniel exhaled sharply, a sound that was meant to dismiss, but instead revealed strain. "I do not take instructions from unverified individuals," he said, the formality of the words unable to fully mask the shift beneath them. Malcolm's eyes met his for the first time, not confrontational, not aggressive, just direct, and in that moment, Daniel felt something he had not expected to feel in his own lobby. Uncertainty. Lauren's hands moved again, almost involuntarily, navigating deeper into the system, past the reservation layer, into internal records that most staff never accessed. The intern watched, unable to look away, as another screen loaded, slower this time, heavier, as if the system itself recognized the weight of what it was about to reveal. And then it appeared: documentation, ownership structure, corporate hierarchy, and at the top, Malcolm Hayes, primary stakeholder, controlling interest. The intern's breath hitched, a quiet sound, but loud enough in the silence that followed. Daniel heard it, turned, and saw the screen for himself. The color drained from his face in a way he could not fully control. Because this was not a misunderstanding, not a miscommunication, this was a complete reversal of everything he had asserted just minutes earlier. Malcolm did not move, did not step forward, did not claim the space that was now undeniably his. He simply stood there, allowing the realization to settle into the room, allowing the weight of it to be felt without a single raised voice. Lauren pushed her chair back slightly, the movement small but significant, as if creating distance from a decision she could no longer stand behind. The intern looked from the screen to Malcolm, her expression shifting from confusion to recognition, not of his face, but of his presence, of the way he had carried himself through the entire exchange without once needing to prove anything until now. Daniel straightened his posture, instinctively trying to regain control, but control, once fractured, does not return easily, especially when it was built on assumption. "If that is accurate," he began, his tone carefully measured, "then there has been a misunderstanding." Malcolm let the words hang for a moment before responding. "There was no misunderstanding," he said quietly, and the room seemed to lean into that sentence. "There was an assumption," he added, and the difference between the two settled heavily in the space between them. Daniel opened his mouth, then closed it again, the usual responses no longer fitting the situation, the usual authority no longer holding. The intern lowered her gaze briefly, not out of submission, but out of the realization that she had just witnessed something shift in real time, not just a moment of conflict, but a moment of exposure. Malcolm finally took a step forward, not rushed, not forceful, just enough to close the distance that had once been used to keep him out. And as he moved, the entire lobby seemed to recalibrate around him, not because he demanded it, but because it had always been his to begin with. Daniel Whitmore did not step back, not immediately, but something in him had already shifted, subtle, internal, like a foundation realizing it had been built on the wrong ground. His shoulders remained squared, his chin slightly raised, but the certainty that had defined him minutes ago was no longer there, replaced by calculation, by the quiet scramble of someone trying to regain control in a room that had already begun to move without him. Malcolm Hayes stopped just short of the desk, not crossing into it, not claiming it physically, because he did not need to. Ownership did not require proximity, it required presence, and his was now undeniable. The marble floor reflected both men, one still trying to hold authority, the other embodying it without effort. Lauren stood frozen behind the counter, her eyes flicking between the screen and Malcolm, as if reconciling two versions of reality that no longer aligned. The intern remained beside her, hands clasped lightly in front of her, the tension in her posture replaced with something else, clarity. She had seen the system, she had seen the name, and now she was watching what happened when truth entered a space that had been shaped by assumption. Malcolm's voice came again, calm, measured, cutting through the air without needing to rise. "You said this lobby was for registered guests," he began, his tone even, almost reflective, as if revisiting a statement rather than challenging it. Daniel did not respond right away, his eyes fixed on Malcolm, searching for something, a crack, a flaw, anything that could restore the narrative he had built. But there was none. Malcolm continued. "You said I could not prove I belonged here." And this time, the words carried weight, not in volume, but in precision, each one landing exactly where it needed to. The couple by the fireplace exchanged a glance, their earlier curiosity now replaced with something closer to realization. The concierge straightened slightly, as if adjusting to a shift in hierarchy that had not been formally announced, but was already understood. Daniel finally spoke, his voice controlled, but softer now, stripped of the edge it had carried before. "Mr. Hayes, if there has been any inconvenience." Malcolm raised a hand, not abruptly, not aggressively, just enough to pause the sentence before it could complete itself. "Do not call it an inconvenience," he said, and the correction was immediate, precise, leaving no room for reinterpretation. The room felt it, the weight of that distinction, because this was not about a delayed check-in or a misplaced reservation. This was about something deeper, something systemic, something that had been exposed in real time. Daniel's jaw tightened again, but this time it was not defiance, it was restraint, the careful management of a response that no longer came naturally. Lauren shifted her weight, her earlier confidence now replaced with discomfort. She glanced at the intern, then back at Malcolm, as if hoping someone else might speak, might redirect the moment. But no one did, because no one needed to. Malcolm's presence had already taken control of the narrative, not through force, but through clarity. He stepped slightly to the side, giving the room a wider view of him, not hiding, not retreating, but standing fully visible in a space that had just minutes ago tried to erase him. "You looked at me," he said, his voice steady, his eyes moving briefly across the staff before returning to Daniel. "And you decided what I could not be." The sentence did not accuse, it revealed. It held up a mirror rather than pointing a finger, and in that mirror, the truth was difficult to avoid. The intern's breath caught again, not from shock this time, but from recognition. She had seen that look before, not always this direct, not always this public, but present enough to understand what Malcolm was saying without needing further explanation. Daniel exhaled slowly, a controlled release, as if buying himself time. "We follow protocol," he said, the words familiar, practiced, but now sounding thinner than before. Malcolm nodded once, acknowledging the statement without accepting its implication. "Protocol does not speak," he replied. "People do." And the simplicity of the sentence cut deeper than anything louder could have, because it stripped away the shield Daniel had tried to use, leaving only the decision itself. The room absorbed that, the quiet realization settling in like a shift in gravity. Lauren's shoulders dropped slightly, the tension she had been holding no longer sustainable under the weight of what had been revealed. The concierge looked down briefly, then back up, as if recalibrating their own understanding of the space they worked in. Malcolm's gaze moved again, this time taking in the entire lobby, the chandeliers, the polished surfaces, the carefully curated atmosphere of luxury that had always promised comfort, exclusivity, belonging. "This place was built to welcome people," he said, not loudly, but clearly enough to reach every corner of the room, not to measure them. The words lingered, not as a declaration, but as a standard, one that had just been tested and found lacking. Daniel's posture shifted again, this time not in resistance, but in something closer to acknowledgement. He straightened his jacket, a small, habitual gesture, but one that now felt more like preparation than defense. "Mr. Hayes," he began again, more carefully this time, "we can correct this immediately." Malcolm's eyes returned to him, steady, unreadable. "This was never about immediate correction," he said, and the sentence settled with finality, because it made clear that the moment had already passed beyond simple resolution, that what had happened could not be undone by a room key or an apology offered too late. The intern lowered her gaze again, not out of avoidance, but out of understanding. She was witnessing something that extended beyond a single interaction, something that spoke to patterns she had only begun to notice, and now could not unsee. Malcolm took one more step forward, closing the last of the distance, not aggressively, not forcefully, but with quiet certainty, and in that movement, the balance of the room completed its shift. "You asked me to leave," he said, his voice calm, but carrying the full weight of the moment. "In a building my name is written on." The sentence did not rise, did not demand, it simply existed, undeniable, and in its presence, everything Daniel had said before unraveled completely. The lobby fell into a silence that was no longer fragile, but absolute, the kind that follows not confusion, but clarity. And Malcolm Hayes, standing where he had been told he did not belong, did not need to say anything more for the truth to be fully seen. No one moved, not right away, because when truth lands that clean, that direct, it does not create chaos, it creates stillness, the kind that forces everyone in the room to sit inside what just happened. Daniel Whitmore stood there, shoulders still squared but no longer anchored. His authority now something he had to consciously hold together instead of something that naturally carried him. His eyes shifted briefly toward the front desk screen again, as if hoping the data might change, might correct itself, but it did not. It remained exactly as it was, clear, structured, undeniable. Malcolm Hayes, primary owner, controlling interest, and that reality did not just sit in the system. It now sat in every mind in the room. Lauren inhaled slowly, her fingers resting flat against the edge of the desk, no longer pretending to work, no longer pretending to lead the interaction. Because leadership had already moved away from her without a word, the intern beside her straightened slightly. Not out of fear, but out of recognition. She was watching a line being drawn, not loudly, not aggressively, but permanently. Malcolm did not rush the silence, did not fill it with explanation or emotion. He allowed it to exist. Because silence, when it follows truth, becomes confirmation, and confirmation does not need repetition. Daniel finally shifted his stance, a small step back, almost imperceptible, but enough to signal that the space between them was no longer his to control. "Mr. Hayes," he said again, and this time the name landed differently, not as a formality, but as an acknowledgement, late, but necessary. "I was not aware," he added, the sentence careful, measured, constructed to soften the moment, but Malcolm did not nod, did not accept the phrasing, because awareness was never the point. Malcolm's gaze remained steady, his voice calm, but firmer now, carrying the weight of everything that had unfolded. "That is exactly the problem," he said, and the sentence did not accuse, it clarified, it drew a straight line between action and cause, leaving no room for the comfort of misunderstanding. Daniel's lips pressed together briefly, the response he might have used earlier no longer fitting the moment. The intern glanced at him, then back at Malcolm, and in that glance, something shifted inside her, something that would stay long after this moment ended, because she was not just witnessing a correction, she was witnessing exposure, the kind that changes how you see every interaction after it. Malcolm took a slow breath, not out of frustration, but out of control, and when he spoke again, his words carried a quiet precision that filled the room without raising his voice. "You did not ask a question," he said. "You made a decision." And the distinction settled heavily in the space, because it removed the safety of uncertainty. It made clear that what had happened was not a lack of information. It was a choice made too quickly, based on something never spoken but clearly understood. Lauren's eyes lowered for a moment, the reflection of the screen still faintly visible in them, as if she could not fully disconnect from the moment she had dismissed. The concierge behind the desk shifted posture, no longer neutral, no longer distant, but attentive, present, aware that what was happening now was not just about one guest. It was about the standard of the entire space. Daniel exhaled again, slower this time. His voice, when it came back, was quieter, stripped of the earlier sharpness. "We can address this properly," he said. And there was an attempt there, not just to fix, but to contain, to bring the moment back into a structure he understood. Malcolm shook his head slightly, not dismissive, but clear. "This is already addressed," he replied. And the finality of that statement closed the gap between what had happened and what could be done about it, because the moment itself had already revealed everything that needed to be seen. The intern's hands tightened slightly at her sides, not out of tension, but out of realization. She understood now why Malcolm had not reacted earlier, why he had not raised his voice or defended himself in the way most people would, because he did not need to. He was allowing the system, the people, the assumptions, to reveal themselves without interruption, and that made the truth impossible to deny. Malcolm's eyes moved across the staff again, not lingering, not accusing, just seeing. "This is not about me standing here," he said. "This is about everyone who stood here before me and did not get a second look." The words were not louder, but they carried further, reaching beyond the moment, beyond the lobby, into something broader, something systemic. The couple by the fireplace lowered their gaze briefly, as if recognizing something they had overlooked in the past. The concierge swallowed, posture tightening, because the statement did not just describe the present, it implicated the past. Daniel remained still, absorbing it, his earlier confidence replaced now with something more complex, something closer to accountability, even if he had not yet fully named it. Malcolm took a single step back, creating space not to retreat, but to reset the room, and in that movement, the dynamic shifted again, no longer a confrontation, but a reckoning. "You told me to leave," he said, his voice steady. "Without once asking why I was here." The sentence landed with quiet force, because it highlighted what had been missing from the beginning. Not information, but curiosity, not protocol, but awareness. Daniel's shoulders lowered slightly, the weight of the moment settling into him in a way that could not be ignored. Lauren finally spoke, her voice softer, less certain than before. "We were following standard procedure," she said, and even as she spoke, the words sounded incomplete. Malcolm looked at her briefly, not unkind, but direct. "Procedure does not remove responsibility," he replied, and the simplicity of the statement left no room for argument. The intern nodded almost imperceptibly, the idea settling into her understanding in a way that would shape how she moved forward. Malcolm's gaze returned to Daniel, the room now fully aligned with the reality of the situation, even if no one had said it out loud yet. "You do not need to correct this for me," he said, his tone calm, final. "You need to understand it." And with that, the moment shifted from exposure to expectation, because what came next would not be about apology, it would be about accountability, and everyone in the lobby knew it. The room did not return to normal, not after that, not after the line had been drawn so clearly that no one could step back across it without feeling the weight of what had just been exposed. The Grand Meridian lobby still looked the same. The chandeliers still glowed. The marbles still reflected polished perfection, but the atmosphere had shifted into something sharper, something aware. Malcolm Hayes stood at the center of it without claiming attention, yet holding all of it, not because he demanded it, but because the truth he carried had already taken its place. Daniel Whitmore remained where he was, but his posture had changed in a way that could not be disguised by straightened shoulders or measured breathing. There was a pause in him now, a gap between thought and response that had not existed before, and in that gap, something uncomfortable had begun to take root. Understanding, Lauren glanced again at the screen, as if the confirmation might disappear if she looked away too long, but it remained, steady, unchanging. Malcolm Hayes, owner, and now the title did not just belong to the system, it belonged to the room. The intern shifted slightly, stepping forward without fully realizing she had done it. Her voice quiet but present. "Sir, I saw the name earlier this morning," she said, and the words entered the space carefully, not as an accusation, but as a truth that had waited too long to be spoken. Daniel turned his head toward her, not sharply, but enough to acknowledge that something else had just entered the narrative. She continued, her voice gaining steadiness as she spoke. It was marked with executive clearance. I thought someone higher up had already checked in remotely. Her eyes moved briefly to Malcolm, then back to Daniel. I should have said something sooner. The admission did not shake the room, but it deepened it, because now the moment was no longer contained to one decision. It revealed a chain, a sequence of missed chances where the outcome could have been different. Malcolm looked at her, not with judgment, but with recognition. You noticed, he said simply, and the weight of that acknowledgement settled gently, not as praise, but as confirmation that awareness mattered, even when it came late. Daniel exhaled slowly, turning his attention back to Malcolm, the shift in the room now impossible to ignore. We will review this internally, he said, the words structured, procedural, a familiar attempt to move the moment into a contained process. But Malcolm did not respond immediately. He let the sentence sit, let its intention unfold, and then he shook his head slightly, not dismissive, but clear. No, he said, and the simplicity of that word stopped the motion Daniel had tried to create. This is not something you review quietly. Malcolm continued, his voice calm, but now carrying a different edge, not anger, but authority. This is something you face directly. The distinction changed the direction of the moment, turning it from something that could be handled behind closed doors into something that had to be acknowledged in the open. The concierge straightened further, eyes focused now, no longer passive. The couple by the fireplace leaned forward, no longer observers, but witnesses. Lauren swallowed again, the earlier confidence completely gone, replaced with something closer to reflection. Malcolm's gaze moved across the staff, not lingering, but deliberate. You said this was about policy, he said. But policy did not tell you who I was. And again, the words cut not by volume, but by precision. Daniel's lips parted slightly, then closed, because the argument he had leaned on had already been dismantled. Malcolm took a breath, steady, controlled, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a clarity that reached every corner of the lobby. What you did was not based on information, he said. It was based on assumption. The sentence did not rise, but it settled with finality, and in that finality, the room understood that there was no path back to what had been said before. The intern lowered her gaze briefly, absorbing it, not as something external, but as something that would shape her own choices going forward. Malcolm's eyes returned to Daniel, steady, unwavering. And assumption, he added, is where mistakes like this begin. Daniel nodded once, slowly, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement that the point could not be avoided. The shift in him now visible not just in posture, but in presence, the certainty replaced by something more measured, more aware. Then tell me what you expect, Daniel said, and the question, though simple, carried weight, because it was no longer about control, it was about direction. Malcolm held his gaze for a moment, letting the question settle, letting the room feel it. And then he answered, I expect you to understand that this is not about one moment, he said. This is about a pattern. The word hung there, heavy, undeniable. The couple by the fireplace exchanged another glance. The concierge's hands tightened slightly at their sides. Lauren looked down again, the implications of that word reaching further than she had considered before. Malcolm continued, his voice steady, deliberate. If it happened to me, it has happened before. And that sentence expanded the room beyond itself, beyond the marble, beyond the chandeliers, into something larger, something systemic, something that could not be dismissed as a single error. Daniel's shoulders lowered slightly, the weight of that realization settling into him, not as defeat, but as responsibility. Malcolm took a step to the side, not retreating, but repositioning, creating space not just physically, but conceptually. You do not fix this with an apology, he said. And again, the words were not loud, but they carried further than anything raised could have. You fix this by changing what made it possible. The room absorbed that, the silence returning, but this time it was not fragile, it was grounded, anchored by clarity. The intern lifted her gaze again, her expression no longer uncertain, but focused, as if something inside her had aligned. Lauren straightened slightly, not in defense, but in awareness, and Daniel Whitmore, standing in the same place where he had once told Malcolm Hayes to leave, understood now that the moment had moved beyond him, beyond his authority, beyond his control, and into something that demanded more than correction. It demanded change. The silence no longer felt heavy. It felt deliberate, like a room that had finally decided to stop pretending it did not see what was right in front of it. And in that stillness, Malcolm Hayes did something unexpected. He did not continue speaking right away. He did not press further. He simply turned his head slightly and looked beyond the desk, beyond Daniel Whitmore, toward the rest of the lobby, as if widening the frame of the moment to include everyone who had witnessed it, because this was no longer just an exchange between two men. It had become something shared, something seen, something that could not be quietly rewritten later. The concierge shifted forward, no longer standing behind the safety of distance, but present, attentive, aware that what came next would define more than just this interaction. The intern stood straighter now, her earlier hesitation replaced with a quiet readiness, and Lauren, still behind the desk, held onto the edge of it not for support, but as if grounding herself in a reality that had just shifted beneath her. Malcolm's voice returned, calm, controlled, but carrying a new clarity, not sharper, but deeper. "You said you would review this internally," he said, and the words were not a question. They were a reflection. Daniel nodded once, slowly, as if reaffirming something he was no longer certain would be enough. Malcolm continued, "That is how things disappear." And the sentence did not accuse. It exposed. It pointed to a process that was designed not to resolve, but to contain, to move moments like this out of sight, out of memory, into reports that would be filed, archived, and eventually forgotten. The intern's eyes widened slightly, because she understood that she had seen small versions of it already. Complaints reduced to summaries, summaries reduced to checkboxes, and checkboxes reduced to nothing. Daniel's expression tightened, not defensively, but in recognition. Because the truth in that statement was not easy to deny, Malcolm took a slow step forward, not closing distance in a confrontational way, but aligning himself with the center of the room, making it clear that what he was about to say was not just for Daniel, but for everyone listening. "This is not going to disappear," he said, and the certainty in his voice did not come from volume. It came from ownership, not just of the building, but of the moment itself. Lauren's breath caught slightly, the implications settling in before the details had even been spoken. The concierge glanced toward Daniel, then back to Malcolm. Understanding that the structure of authority had already shifted, Malcolm reached into his pocket again, slowly, deliberately, and this time when he brought his phone out, he did not hold it to himself. He held it slightly outward, visible, present. "Everything that happened here," he said, "has already been logged." The words landed quietly, but their impact spread immediately. Daniel's eyes flicked to the device, then back to Malcolm, the realization forming quickly. Malcolm was not reacting to the moment. He had been documenting it, structuring it, preparing it. From the beginning, the intern's breath steadied, her earlier uncertainty replaced with a sense of understanding that what she was witnessing was not spontaneous. It was intentional. Malcolm's voice remained even, precise. Timestamps, system access, staff responses. He continued, every step. And with each word, the room felt less like a space of interpretation and more like a space of record, something that could not be reshaped after the fact. Daniel inhaled slowly, his posture adjusting again, not to reclaim authority, but to meet the reality that had just been presented. "Then we will cooperate fully," he said, and this time the words were not defensive, they were measured, careful. Malcolm nodded once, acknowledging the statement, but not softening his stance, because cooperation was not the same as accountability, and the difference mattered. "You will do more than cooperate," Malcolm said, his tone still calm, but now carrying the weight of expectation. "You will correct what allowed this to happen." And the sentence did not sound like a request, it sounded like a directive, the kind that does not need to be enforced loudly because it is already understood. Lauren lowered her gaze again, her earlier certainty replaced with reflection. The intern remained still, absorbing every word, knowing that this moment would shape how she saw every future interaction. The concierge straightened fully now, no longer a passive observer, but part of a space that was being redefined in real time. Malcolm shifted his weight slightly, Not stepping back, not stepping forward, but settling into a position that made it clear he was not leaving. Not until what needed to be said had been fully heard. "This building carries a name," he said, and the words felt heavier than anything before them, because they pointed to something larger than the moment, larger than the interaction, larger than the individuals involved. "And that name is supposed to mean something," he continued, his voice steady, unwavering. "Not just to people who look like they belong here, but to everyone who walks through those doors." The sentence extended beyond the room, beyond the staff, into the very identity of the place itself. Daniel's shoulders lowered slightly, not in defeat, but in acknowledgement of the responsibility that had just been placed in front of him. Lauren looked up briefly, meeting Malcolm's gaze for the first time without defensiveness, only awareness. The intern's posture remained steady, her presence now grounded. Malcolm let the silence return again, but this time it was not to expose, it was to settle, to allow the weight of what had been said to take hold. And in that silence, the Grand Meridian lobby was no longer just a space of luxury. It had become something else, something accountable, something seen, something that could not return to what it had been before. And Malcolm Hayes, standing exactly where he had been told he did not belong, did not need to raise his voice to make it clear that the standard of this place had just been rewritten. The shift was no longer subtle. It had settled into the room completely, like a new gravity that everyone now had to stand under whether they wanted to or not. And in that gravity, no one moved the same way. Not Daniel Whitmore, not Lauren, not even the guests who had once tried to stay detached from what they were witnessing, because detachment was no longer possible. Not after everything had been laid out with such quiet precision. Malcolm Hayes lowered his phone slowly, not as if the action were finished, but as if the point had already been made. And it had, fully, completely, without the need for repetition. Daniel stood still for a moment longer. Then something in his posture changed again, not just a shift of weight, but a shift of role, because the man who had spoken with certainty minutes ago was no longer operating from that same place. He was recalibrating, and that recalibration was visible. "We will make immediate adjustments," he said, and the words were no longer framed as control, but as response. Malcolm watched him for a moment, his expression unreadable, not dismissive, not approving, just present. "Immediate is not enough," Malcolm replied, and the sentence did not rise. It settled, like everything else he said, deliberate, controlled, leaving no space for misinterpretation. Daniel nodded once, slowly, understanding that this was not about speed, it was about depth. Lauren finally stepped away from the desk, just a few inches, but enough to signal that she was no longer hiding behind the position she had held. Her voice, when it came, was quieter than before. "What would you have done differently?" she asked, and the question did not sound defensive. It sounded uncertain, and that uncertainty mattered, because it meant something had already begun to shift inside her. Malcolm turned his gaze toward her, not sharply, but directly. "I would have started with a question," he said, and the simplicity of that answer carried more weight than any long explanation could have. The intern nodded, almost instinctively, the truth of it landing immediately, because it was not complicated, it was fundamental, and yet it had been completely bypassed. Malcolm continued. "Who are you? How can I help you? What brings you here?" he said, each phrase measured, clear. "Not who do you think you are?" And the distinction cut clean, separating service from assumption, professionalism from bias. The concierge lowered their eyes briefly, not out of discomfort, but reflection, as if revisiting past interactions through a new lens. Daniel exhaled slowly, absorbing it, not resisting, not interrupting, just listening, which in itself was a change. Malcolm shifted his stance slightly, turning just enough to include the rest of the staff in his line of sight, not isolating anyone, but making it clear that this was not a private correction. This was a collective one. "This is not about one mistake," he said, and the room leaned into that sentence before he even finished it. "This is about a pattern that feels normal until someone refuses to accept it." And with that, the moment expanded again, reaching beyond the individuals standing there into something broader, something that had existed long before this morning. The couple near the fireplace exchanged another glance, this time not out of curiosity, but recognition. The intern stood still, her earlier uncertainty now replaced with a quiet resolve, as if she had already decided that she would not repeat what she had just seen. Malcolm's voice remained steady, controlled, but now there was something else in it. Not anger, not frustration, but intention. You do not correct patterns with apologies, he said. You correct them with structure. And the word structure landed differently, because it implied something lasting, something that would outlive this moment. Daniel nodded again, more firmly this time, the weight of responsibility settling into him in a way that could not be ignored. Then we will rebuild the process, he said. And this time there was no attempt to soften it, no attempt to contain it, just a direct acknowledgement of what needed to happen. Malcolm held his gaze for a moment, then gave a single nod, not approval, but acceptance of the direction. Lauren looked at the intern, then back at Malcolm, her voice still quiet, but steadier now. We missed it, she said, and the admission was simple, but it carried weight, because it was not deflecting, not explaining, just stating the truth. Malcolm's eyes softened slightly, not in forgiveness, but in recognition. You did not miss it, he said. You chose not to see it. And the correction was immediate, precise, and it landed without cruelty, but with clarity. The intern inhaled slowly, the words settling deep, reshaping how she understood what had just happened. Daniel's shoulders lowered further, not in defeat, but in acceptance. Because the distinction mattered, because it meant that what had happened was not accidental. It was preventable, and prevention required more than awareness. It required change. Malcolm took a step back, not leaving, not disengaging, but creating space again, allowing the room to breathe under the weight of everything that had just been said. This place will be better, he said, and the sentence was not hopeful. It was certain, because it has to be. And in that certainty, there was no room left for the old way of doing things. No room left for assumptions to go unchallenged. No room left for silence to protect what should have been questioned. The lobby stood still, not in tension now, but in transition, and Malcolm Hayes, who had been told to leave just minutes earlier, had not only stayed, he had redefined what it meant to belong in that space without ever needing to raise his voice. The room did not rush to move forward, not after everything had been said, because progress, real progress, does not come from speed. It comes from understanding. And understanding takes a moment to settle. Malcolm Hayes stood quietly, not commanding the room anymore, but no longer needing to, because what he had said had already taken root, not just in Daniel Whitmore, not just in Lauren, but in everyone who had witnessed the shift from assumption to truth. The intern took a slow breath, her shoulders no longer tense, her posture now grounded in something she could not unlearn. The concierge moved slightly closer to the desk, not out of obligation, but out of alignment, as if stepping into a role that now required more awareness than before. Daniel looked around the lobby, really looked this time, not at the decor, not at the polished surfaces, but at the people, the guests, the staff, the small reactions that had once been easy to overlook. And in that looking, something else became clear. This moment was not isolated, it was representative. Malcolm's voice broke the silence again, softer now, not because it carried less weight, but because it no longer needed to cut through resistance. This place will continue after I walk away, he said, and the sentence shifted the focus forward, beyond the immediate moment, into what would come next. Daniel nodded slowly, understanding that the responsibility did not end when the conversation did. Malcolm continued. The question is whether it continues the same way. And that question did not demand an answer out loud. It demanded one in action. Lauren straightened slightly, her earlier uncertainty now evolving into something more intentional. Her voice, when it came, was steady. It will not, she said, and there was no defensiveness in it, only commitment. The intern glanced at her, then back at Malcolm, and for the first time since the moment began, there was something close to alignment between them, not because the situation had been easy, but because it had been seen clearly. Malcolm acknowledged the statement with a slight nod, not as approval, but as recognition that the shift had begun. Daniel took a step forward, not to reclaim space, but to meet it. We will implement immediate retraining, he said, his tone measured, grounded, not just on procedure, but on awareness. And this time, the words carried substance, because they were no longer about appearance. They were about change. Malcolm held his gaze for a moment, then spoke again. Training is where it starts, he said, not where it ends. And the distinction settled into the room, because it made clear that this was not a one-time correction. It was an ongoing responsibility. The concierge nodded slightly, absorbing it. The intern's expression remained focused, as if already considering what that responsibility would look like in practice. Malcolm shifted his attention briefly to her. "You spoke up," he said, and the acknowledgement was simple, but it carried meaning. She straightened a little more, surprised but steady. "Late," she replied quietly, and Malcolm shook his head once, not dismissing her concern, but reframing it. "You spoke," he said, "and that matters." And in that moment, something in her posture changed again, not just awareness, but confidence, the kind that comes from knowing that action, even imperfect action, has weight. Daniel watched the exchange, and something in his expression softened, not in weakness, but in understanding that leadership did not come from control. It came from what you allowed, what you encouraged, what you corrected. Malcolm's gaze returned to him, steady, unwavering. "What happens next will define more than this moment," he said, and the sentence carried forward, beyond the room, beyond the day, into the identity of the place itself. Daniel nodded, more firmly this time, the hesitation gone, replaced with something clearer, more deliberate. "Then it will be defined." "Correctly," he replied, and the words did not sound like a defense. They sounded like a decision. Lauren stepped forward slightly, no longer behind the desk, no longer separated by position, but part of the same space, the same responsibility, the same expectation. Malcolm looked around the lobby one last time, not scanning, not assessing, but acknowledging the guests who had watched, the staff who had stood still, the space that had revealed itself in ways it had not intended to. And in that acknowledgement, there was no anger, no lingering tension, only clarity. "This is not about proving who belongs," he said quietly. "It is about removing the idea that anyone has to." And the sentence settled into the room with a finality that did not need emphasis, because it carried truth without resistance. The chandeliers still glowed, the marbles still reflected the room, but the space itself felt different now. Not because it had changed physically, but because it had been seen. Fully, honestly, without interruption, Malcolm took a step back, not retreating, not disengaging, but completing the moment, allowing it to stand on its own without further explanation. And as he did, the room did not return to what it had been before. It moved forward, quietly, deliberately, shaped by what had just been made impossible to ignore. The moment did not end when Malcolm Hayes stepped back. It expanded, stretching beyond the space he had occupied and settling into every corner of the lobby like a new standard that could not be undone. The air no longer carried tension. It carried awareness. And awareness does not fade as quickly as discomfort. Daniel Whitmore stood still for a few seconds longer, not frozen, but processing, recalibrating in real time. Because what had just happened was not something his training had prepared him for. Not in the way it had unfolded, not with the clarity it had exposed. Lauren moved first, stepping fully out from behind the desk, no longer shielded by position or routine, her posture straighter now, not defensive, but intentional. The concierge followed, aligning themselves with the front of the space rather than behind it. And the intern remained where she was, but something about her presence had changed completely. She was no longer observing the moment. She was part of what came. Next, Malcolm watched quietly, not directing, not instructing, but allowing the room to move forward on its own, because real change is not commanded, it is chosen. Daniel finally spoke again, his voice steady, but different now, stripped of assumption, grounded in something more deliberate. "We are going to reset this space," he said, and the sentence did not sound like a reaction, it sounded like a decision. Lauren nodded slightly, already moving toward the system, not to check, not to verify, but to begin adjusting access protocols, her hands no longer hesitant. The intern stepped beside her, not waiting to be told, but ready to assist, her earlier uncertainty replaced with purpose. Malcolm's eyes followed the movement, not approving, not evaluating, just observing the shift as it happened. The couple near the fireplace stood slowly, their conversation forgotten, one of them speaking quietly. "That should have never happened," and the other nodded, not adding anything, because the statement did not need expansion. The truth of it was already understood. The concierge turned toward the entrance, watching as a new guest stepped in, a man in a travel-worn jacket, carrying a single bag, pausing just inside the doorway as he looked around, and for a brief second, the entire room seemed to hold its breath again, not out of tension, but out of awareness, because this was the test, immediate, unplanned, real. Lauren looked up from the desk, her voice calm, measured. "Welcome to the Grand Meridian," she said. And the difference was immediate, not in the words, but in the tone, in the presence. In the absence of judgment, the man nodded, slightly surprised, and stepped forward, the concierge moving to assist him without hesitation, without pause, without assumption. Malcolm watched it unfold, the small moment carrying more weight than anything that had been said before, because it was not theory, it was action. Daniel noticed it too, his gaze following the interaction, and something in his expression shifted again. Not just understanding, but recognition. This was what the space was supposed to be, not selective, not conditional, but open. Malcolm took a slow breath, the tension that had once filled the room now replaced with something steadier, something constructive. He turned slightly, not leaving yet, but no longer at the center, allowing the space to operate without him. Because the point had never been to dominate the moment, it had been to change it. The intern glanced at him briefly, then back to the desk, her movements now confident, precise, as if she had stepped into a version of herself she had not fully realized before. Lauren continued adjusting the system, her focus sharp, not out of pressure, but out of commitment. Daniel stepped closer to the desk, not to oversee, but to participate, his presence no longer about authority, but about alignment. Malcolm's voice came one last time, quiet, but clear. "This is how it starts," he said, and the sentence did not interrupt the flow of the room. It fit into it, like a final piece settling into place. Daniel nodded once, not looking at Malcolm, but at the space itself. "And this is how it continues," he replied, and for the first time, the words did not feel like a response. They felt like a continuation. Malcolm gave a slight nod, not needing to say anything more, because the moment had moved beyond him, beyond the confrontation, into something sustainable, something that would carry forward long after he walked out of the lobby. He turned then, not abruptly, not dramatically, but simply, and began to walk toward the elevators, his steps measured, unhurried, the same way he had entered. But the space he left behind was not the same one he had walked into. The chandeliers still glowed, the marbles still reflected light, but the standard of the room had shifted, not because of policy, not because of procedure, but because someone had refused to let assumption go unchallenged. And as the elevator doors opened and Malcolm Hayes stepped inside, the lobby continued, not as it had been, but as it had just learned to be. The elevator doors closed with a quiet precision, sealing Malcolm Hayes inside a space that felt smaller than the presence he carried. Yet even as the doors slid shut, the impact of what had happened outside did not remain contained in the lobby. It followed him upward, not as tension, but as reflection, because moments like that do not end when the scene changes. They continue, unfolding in the spaces they leave behind. Malcolm stood still inside the elevator, his hands resting loosely at his sides, his expression unchanged, calm, measured, but his eyes, for just a brief moment, shifted, not outward, but inward, as if replaying something older than what had just occurred. The hum of the elevator was steady, almost quiet, but in that quiet, memories surfaced, not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to be felt. A younger version of himself, standing in a different lobby years ago, holding a confirmation email that no one bothered to read, hearing words that sounded polite but carried the same meaning, that he did not belong, that his presence needed to be justified, that silence would be mistaken for acceptance. And back then, he had left, not because he agreed, but because he did not yet have the power to stay. The elevator continued its ascent, floor numbers lighting up one by one, and Malcolm exhaled slowly, not out of frustration, but out of recognition. Because the difference between then and now was not just success, it was understanding that moments, like the one he had just experienced, were not isolated. They were patterns, repeated, reinforced, until someone decided to interrupt them. The doors opened again, revealing the quiet hallway of the executive floor. The contrast immediate, controlled lighting, soft carpeting, an environment designed to feel removed from everything below. But Malcolm did not step out right away. He paused for a fraction of a second, as if acknowledging that the real work was not in the distance from the lobby, but in what would follow it. Then he stepped forward, his footsteps soft against the carpet, moving with the same steady rhythm he had carried since the beginning. Inside the lobby, the shift continued to unfold, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a clarity that could not be undone. Daniel Whitmore stood near the front desk, no longer at its center, but beside it, his posture aligned with the team rather than above it. Lauren continued working through the system, but her movements were different now, not reactive, but intentional, each adjustment made with awareness rather than assumption. The intern stood beside her, no longer hesitant, her voice steady as she confirmed updates. Access flags adjusted. Guest profile visibility expanded, she said, and the words were not just technical, they were foundational, small changes that would prevent the same moment from repeating. The concierge moved seamlessly between guests, their tone consistent, their presence open, and the difference was not forced, it was natural, because once awareness is introduced, it changes behavior without needing to be enforced. Daniel watched the team, not as a supervisor, but as someone learning, recalibrating his understanding of what leadership required, not control, but clarity, not authority, but accountability. He turned slightly toward Lauren, his voice lower now, not because of uncertainty, but because of intention. "We are documenting everything," he said, and this time, the words did not sound like a containment strategy, they sounded like a commitment. Lauren nodded, her focus steady. "Every interaction, every update, no gaps," she replied, and the intern added, "And we flag anything that feels like assumption, not just policy violations." And that addition mattered, because it shifted the standard from rules to awareness, from compliance to understanding. The couple by the fireplace remained for a moment longer, watching the change unfold, not as spectators, but as witnesses to something that had moved beyond a single interaction. One of them spoke quietly. "It is different already," and the other nodded, not needing to elaborate, because the difference was visible, tangible, present. Outside the building, the city continued as it always did, traffic moving, people passing, unaware of the shift that had just taken place inside. But inside, the space carried that shift forward, not as a reaction, but as a new baseline. Malcolm reached the end of the hallway, stopping briefly outside a suite, his hand resting lightly against the door handle. He did not rush to enter, because the moment in the lobby was still with him, not as tension, but as purpose. He understood that what had happened was not about proving who he was, it was about revealing what needed to change, and that understanding was what made the moment matter beyond itself. He opened the door and stepped inside, the room quiet, composed, untouched by what had unfolded below. But he knew better, because change does not always show itself in walls or furniture. It shows itself in people, in behavior, in the decisions made after the moment has passed. Back in the lobby, Daniel took a slow breath, then spoke again, not to assert, but to align. "This is the standard now," he said, and the sentence did not feel like an order. It felt like a foundation. Lauren nodded. The intern nodded. The concierge moved with it, and the space itself, the Grand Meridian lobby, no longer felt like a place where someone had to prove they belonged. It felt like a place that had finally understood what belonging meant, and that understanding, once seen, does not disappear, it becomes the new way forward. The suite door closed behind Malcolm Hayes with a soft click, a sound so controlled it almost disappeared into the quiet of the room. But the silence that followed was not empty. It was full, layered with everything that had just unfolded downstairs. Malcolm stood for a moment near the entrance, not moving further in, not reaching for anything, just allowing the stillness to settle around him. Because even in a space designed for comfort, reflection does not come automatically, it comes when something demands to be understood. His eyes moved slowly across the room, the carefully arranged furniture, the skyline stretching beyond the glass, the kind of view meant to signal success, arrival, status. But none of that held his attention for long, because what mattered was not the space itself, it was what had just been revealed about it, about the people inside it, about the system that had allowed a moment like that to happen in the first place. Malcolm walked further in, setting his phone down on the table without looking at it, not because it was unimportant, but because its role had already been fulfilled. Everything had been documented, every word, every pause, every decision, and now the focus was no longer on capturing the moment, but on what would follow it. Downstairs, the lobby did not return to routine. It evolved, subtly but clearly, like a space adjusting its own posture. Daniel Whitmore stood at the center of it, but not in the way he had before, no longer as the unquestioned authority, but as someone actively redefining what that authority meant. He turned toward the team, his voice steady, grounded. "We are not moving forward until we understand exactly where this broke," he said, and the sentence carried a different kind of weight, not urgency, but depth. Lauren nodded, her hands already moving across the system, not just making adjustments, but reviewing logs, timestamps, access patterns, looking for the points where assumption had replaced inquiry. The intern stood beside her, focused, alert, no longer waiting for direction, but contributing to it. "There was a flag this morning," she said, pulling up a screen. "Executive access," marked clearly, but it was not acknowledged. Daniel stepped closer, looking at the data, not dismissing it, not explaining it away, just seeing it, fully, and that act alone marked a shift, because before, the system had been used to confirm assumptions. Now it was being used to challenge them. The concierge moved between guests with a steady rhythm, their tone consistent, their attention present, and the difference was no longer subtle. It was structural, embedded in the way each interaction began, not with judgment, but with openness. Malcolm moved toward the window, looking out over the city, his reflection faint against the glass. And for a moment, the present blended with memory again, not sharply, not painfully, but clearly. He remembered what it felt like to stand in a place like this and be unseen, not because he lacked presence, but because someone else had decided not to recognize it. And that memory did not pull him backward, it anchored him forward, because it reminded him that what had happened today was not new. It was part of a pattern, and patterns only change when they are interrupted. Downstairs, Daniel straightened slightly, his voice firm, not raised, but certain. "From this point forward, we do not assume," he said, and the words did not sound like a guideline. They sounded like a reset. Lauren paused her typing just long enough to acknowledge it. The intern nodded, the concierge adjusted their stance, and the room itself seemed to align with the statement. Because it was no longer theoretical, it had been tested, and it had failed. Malcolm turned from the window, his gaze steady, his posture unchanged. But there was something different now, not in how he stood, but in what the moment had clarified. He was not there to prove anything. He had never been. He was there to reveal something, and that had been done, fully, completely, without excess, without escalation, without needing to force the truth into the room, because it had already been there, waiting to be acknowledged. Back in the lobby, the couple who had been watching finally made their way toward the exit, one of them pausing briefly at the desk. "Thank you for addressing that," they said quietly, and Lauren met their gaze, not with a rehearsed response, but with a simple, genuine nod. "It should have been addressed sooner," she replied, and the honesty in that response did not feel like weakness. It felt like progress. The intern watched the exchange, understanding that accountability was not about perfection, it was about recognition. Daniel observed it as well, and something in his expression shifted again, not in reaction, but in reinforcement, because this was what change looked like, not loud, not dramatic, but consistent, present in each interaction that followed. Malcolm picked up his phone again, not to review, not to revisit, but to move forward. His thumb hovered over the screen for a brief second before pressing, initiating a follow-up, not to revisit the past, but to ensure the future aligned with what had just been set in motion. The response came quickly, confirmation. Systems flagged, oversight engaged, the structure already beginning to adapt. Malcolm set the phone down again, his movements unhurried, his presence steady, because he understood something that not everyone in that building did yet, that moments like this are not defined by how they begin, but by how they are carried forward. And as the city continued outside, unaware of the shift that had taken place within those walls, the Grand Meridian was no longer the same space it had been before, not because of what had happened, but because of what had been learned. and more importantly, what had been accepted. And Malcolm Hayes, standing in the quiet of the suite above it all, knew that the real impact of that moment was not in the confrontation, but in the change that would follow it, long after the words had faded and the silence had settled. The city outside did not slow down. It never did. Traffic moved, lights shifted, people crossed streets without knowing that inside one building, something had changed in a way that could not be reversed. Malcolm Hayes stood near the window a moment longer, not because he needed the view, but because he understood what moments like this required after they ended. Not celebration, not reaction, but clarity. And clarity did not come from noise. It came from stillness. He turned back into the room, his steps quiet against the floor, his presence as controlled as it had been from the moment he walked into the lobby. His phone buzzed once, then again, not loudly, but persistently. The response he had initiated was already unfolding beyond the walls of the Grand Meridian. Compliance teams, oversight channels, system audits, all moving into place with a speed that matched the precision he had activated earlier. He glanced at the screen briefly, not surprised, not impressed, just confirming what he already knew would happen, then set it down again, because the work was already in motion. Downstairs, the lobby continued to operate, but it no longer felt like it was running on habit. It felt intentional. Each movement, each interaction, each decision carried a level of awareness that had not been there before. Daniel Whitmore stood beside the front desk, not behind it. His position no longer elevated above the team, but aligned with it, and that alignment mattered because it changed how leadership was seen, not as distance, but as presence. Lauren worked through the system with steady focus, no longer reacting to what appeared, but anticipating what needed to be addressed, her voice calm as she spoke. We have updated guest verification flow. No profile is hidden behind tier assumptions anymore. The intern stood beside her, following every step, learning in real time. Her voice adding quietly but clearly, and all executive level flags now require acknowledgement before any denial action can be taken. The adjustment was small in structure, but massive in impact, because it removed the space where assumption could operate unchecked. Daniel nodded once, absorbing it, not as a technical update, but as a correction of something deeper, something cultural. The concierge moved toward a new guest entering the lobby, greeting them with the same tone, the same presence, the same respect, no variation, no hesitation, and in that consistency, the new standard became visible, not announced, but lived. The guest responded with ease, stepping forward without the invisible barrier that had once existed. Malcolm sat down briefly, not to rest, but to think, his posture relaxed but his mind active, because he knew that what had happened was not finished, not truly. Moments like that did not end in a lobby. They extended outward, into systems, into policies, into the way people chose to act when no one was watching. His thoughts moved again, briefly, to that younger version of himself, the one who had walked away from a similar moment years ago, not because he accepted it, but because he had not yet built the power to confront it. And that memory did not bring frustration, it brought perspective, because it reminded him that what had happened today was not about him alone. It was about every version of that moment that had gone unchallenged before. Downstairs, Daniel spoke again, not loudly, but with intention. "We are not waiting for another moment like this to fix what we missed," he said, and the sentence carried a weight that did not need emphasis, because it was grounded in what had just been experienced. Lauren looked up briefly, meeting his gaze, then nodded. The intern mirrored the movement. The concierge adjusted slightly, and the room itself seemed to align with the statement, not as a reaction, but as a direction, a path forward that had been made visible through exposure. Malcolm picked up his phone again, scrolling briefly through the confirmations that continued to come in. Audit requests approved, training protocols flagged for revision. Oversight expanded beyond this single location, and as he read, his expression did not change, because this was not about reaction, it was about execution. The system was doing what it was designed to do when activated correctly, and that was the difference, not just in ownership, but in understanding how to use it. He stood again, moving toward the center of the room, his steps measured, deliberate, because even now, even after everything, his presence remained consistent, not reactive, not performative, just steady, the same way it had been from the beginning. In the lobby, the couple who had been watching earlier had now left, replaced by new guests, new interactions, new opportunities to apply what had just been learned, and the staff met those moments differently, not because they were told to, but because they had seen what happened when they did not. Daniel glanced once more at the front desk, then toward the entrance, then back at the team, his voice quieter now, but clear. "This is where it holds," he said, and the sentence did not need to be explained, because everyone understood what he meant. This was where the change either stayed or disappeared. This was where awareness either became habit or faded back into routine. Malcolm paused, near the door of the suite, his hand resting lightly against it, not opening it yet, not leaving the space, because he understood that moments like this required one final thing, not action, not words, but intention, the decision to carry forward what had just been revealed. And as he stood there, looking out over a city that continued without knowing what had shifted inside one building, he knew that the true impact of what had happened was not in the confrontation, not in the exposure, but in the choice that followed it, the choice to change. And that choice, once made clearly, does not fade. It becomes the new standard, the one that defines everything that comes after. The door remained closed for just a moment longer before Malcolm Hayes finally turned the handle and stepped out, not because he needed to leave, but because the moment had reached its natural end, not in silence, but in resolution, the kind that does not announce itself loudly, but settles into place with quiet certainty. The hallway stretched before him, still, controlled, unchanged on the surface, yet everything beneath it felt different, because change does not always show itself in what you see. It reveals itself in what you understand. Malcolm walked forward at the same measured pace he had carried from the beginning, not hurried, not slowed, just steady, because nothing about her work, her posture confident, aligned with the standards she now understood. The concierge continued assisting a guest nearby, their tone unchanged, their presence steady, and that was the point, not to perform differently for one person, but to operate consistently for everyone. Malcolm walked through the lobby, not at the center, not drawing attention, but moving through it as it was meant to be experienced, without resistance, without question, without the need to justify his presence. And as he reached the entrance, the doors opening automatically before him, the city beyond felt no different, but he knew better, because inside that building, something had shifted in a way that would not easily reverse. He paused for a brief second just outside the doorway, not to reflect on what had happened, but to acknowledge what had been established, then stepped forward into the flow of the city, leaving behind a space that no longer required him to prove anything, because it had learned not to ask. Inside, Daniel stood where Malcolm had been moments earlier, looking across the lobby, not at any one person, but at the system itself, the structure, the behavior, the standard, and he understood now that leadership was not about maintaining what existed. It was about correcting what should not have been allowed to exist in the first place. Lauren continued her work with focus, the intern beside her, the concierge moving seamlessly, and together, they formed something new, not perfect, not complete, but aligned, and that alignment mattered, because it meant the change was real, not temporary. Malcolm Hayes did not look back as he walked away, because he did not need to. The proof was already there, not in recognition, not in apology, but in transformation, and that was the only outcome that had ever mattered.